Good morning. I bring you greetings from Memphis, where FedEx is headquartered and where we enjoy pork barbecue. So come visit. We started our Web3 and blockchain journey in 2017. I was VP of Strategic Planning and Support for one of the FedEx operating companies, FedEx Freight, in the heavy freight division. And we were trying to solve a quality problem. So we're going to hit the C-suite side of things a lot today. I'm not on the technical side. I'm on the business and strategy side. You're going to have a lot of bright and capable experts on the technical side, so save your technical questions for them if you would. But I get to kind of paint the broader picture today, hopefully for the speakers that will follow. We were simply starting with a use case. We had a receiver in the big box retail space. I'm not going to throw any names out there, but in the big box retail space, we had somebody that you would recognize that ordered 100 items, let's just say, from somebody who shipped it, who you would also recognize, and then we were the carrier. And so what happened in a case like that, I'm not going to go too deep into that, but you'll see very quickly that while it happened to be our first use case, it also translates into a lot of other scenarios from a business point of view, which is the receiver ordered 100 items on a purchase order. The shipper fulfilled it, received it, and then fulfilled it within different groups within that. It comes down the conveyor. In our case, we were in the heavy freight division, so most of our product moved on pallets or skids. How many of those items could you put on a skid? Get you to something like 40. They put shrink wrap around the skid. They do 40 more, put shrink wrap around the skid. Then they translate it, this is important, from a purchase order to a bill of lading for movement. We now receive a bill of lading to move 2 pallets back to that receiver. And 3 weeks later, we get a delivery exception that says, hey, you're short, there's a problem. And we ended up with a couple of $1 million a year in claims. And the shipper ended up with something like $25 million a year in chargebacks. So it sounded, we were fine for a moment there, and then we weren't fine. And we were simply trying to create a common language, a common data language. We didn't know what was on the order. As it turns out, they only shipped them because you could only fit that many on our pallets, right? So there were 20 others that needed to be accounted for. But between all the departments that got involved with all of that, somebody didn't do this, somebody sent it to the claims group, somebody didn't do this, it didn't connect, whatever the case may be. And now there's all this movement, there's all this friction that's going back and forth from that point of view. So that was our first use case. But I can tell you that I have the luxury, it is a luxury that I never take for granted, of working for an entity that goes to 220 countries and territories. Wherever you can go, we go. And at that level, I'm gonna drag you from this beautiful room up into the International Space Station for just a second. At that level, at 220 country and territory level, there is no FedEx, there is no industry, there are no borders. And so that's the conversation I want the C-suite representatives here and the people who are representing them to start thinking about. At that level, data is going to all have to come together. So the initial focus in this case was for a lot of people to treat blockchain or Web3 just like the internet. Let's get 3 or 4 really smart folks, let's sign non-disclosures, and let's create a product really quickly, get it out on the market, and we're all going to get rich. And then we can do it again. And a lot of people spent a lot of time, and I've got a slide coming up that walks through some of those things. We finally realized that, yes, we needed to learn what is blockchain, what is it not? Mostly, what is it not, right? We've got very ruggedized databases. We handle millions and millions of shipments a day. This is not going to disrupt virtually any of our databases. What blockchain does is very unique. So where provenance matters, where authenticity or pedigree matters, it's going to transform. We think it's going to be very, very unique. So it's not a matter of let's just start with all things we can brainstorm and there's going to be a blockchain solution on that. It's not blockchain bingo. There's very few applications that actually work for it in terms of use cases. But the aha moment for me, back into that International Space Station for a second, was our primary product essentially is moving product around the world. You're very familiar with the name. It's been around. You understand, and if I asked most of you, you would say, well, what does FedEx do? Well, they move something from point A to point B. Well, in that case, if I purchase something from you across a border, across an ocean, or both, there are a lot of people that sit between you and me, that sit between supply and demand. So think of it as supply and demand. You've got a broker, you've got a forwarder, you've got a brother-in-law, I know some lady. You've got all these people that sit between us in a lot of transactions. And the aha moment for me at that point was when we start talking about Web 3, which gets you, so we were talking about this in the video thing earlier, I would describe Web 1 as essentially read. Early on, late 80s, we could simply click on something and go to read it. So think of the word read. By the early 2000s, we got to current Web 2, where you could read and write. Web 3 is essentially read, write, and own. You're going to own your own data. You're going to own that from that point of view. That is really a reference to peer-to-peer technology. So where peer-to-peer comes into play, if you and I can find each other, we may not, in a trusted environment like blockchain, we may no longer need a ride-sharing app. We may no longer need a lot of scenarios that we think of from a middleman point of view. There's a lot of models. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But when we get to the point of who should be paying attention to this, if those of you sit in this kind of middleman role, you should be in this space right now. And you don't need to know how to code it. I'm not going to tell you how to code it. Others may do that. I'm going to tell you that from a true business point of view, where I'm sitting there in the C-suite with risk and opportunity responsibilities and with fiduciary responsibilities, if somebody can come in and disrupt my model, if my model is to introduce supply and demand, and now somebody else can do that without me in the middle of that, I would want to know that up front. I would want that to be discussed in the C-suite. I would want to be able to work my way through that. Even if I'm not a technology expert, you don't have to, but you've got somebody that works for you that can learn it for you and can bring it back to the C-suite and have those conversations. So with that being said, we're going to talk about peer-to-peer, we're going to talk about smart contracts, but again, my approach today is at that C-suite level. And so from that point of view, I can tell you that by the end of 2017, we were doing a lot of work internally, and by early 2018, two of our executives were on stage here in New York City at Consensus, which was the biggest event of its kind in the world, again, pre-pandemic from that point of view. Lots of people, big audience, a lot of media, a lot of everything else. And our founder, Fred Smith, is known for just saying things, just like say it and say it in a really unique way, and be one or two hills way beyond anybody else of what's occurred to them. He just like throws it out there. So in this case, he calmly sat there and said, well, we actually think blockchain is going to completely transform worldwide supply chains. No big deal. Just completely transform it. I mean, this is a guy who invented the industry, essentially, founded FedEx back in the 70s, and today is still our executive chairman. He is a true visionary from that point of view. I've got one more quote in the slides that will show that to you from the late 70s. And he went on to say, if you're not operating at the edge of innovation, you need to be prepared to be commoditized or to potentially become extinct. That's pretty bold talk from somebody sitting on a panel. And now you're like, wait a second, that just got real. But that's exactly the way he thinks. So by early 2018, our executives already got to that point. The reason I start with these quotes, is that lots of companies can have evangelists. I can be an evangelist, right? I'm not up here advertising for FedEx. This is actually more of a global thought leadership discussion from that point of view, though I certainly represent FedEx proudly. But as an evangelist, as that one guy that's in the third floor hallway, every time you walk down on the third floor and I'm pestering you, oh, come here, let me tell you about blockchain. You're like, Dale, I'm sorry, I got to go the other way. Good to see you, whoomp, and pretty soon you just avoid the third floor hallway, right? In this case, it's very, very different when you've got the C-suite involved. Now it's more strategic. Now it's where it needs to go, because otherwise I'm just trying to convince somebody of the inherent goodness of some technology that makes no sense, and it's not intuitive. And so that's why I lead with quotes from the corner office, from the C-suite, right? The following year, we had reached the point where blockchain, if you think of that group of really bright, capable people all under non-disclosure, and you say, we're going to go get rich and we're going to treat it like the internet and go from there, we realize that in some industries, you could think of, the healthcare industry in the US or others, maybe a small enough industry to where if you could get 10 or 20 or even 50 people in that industry to sign a non-disclosure and to work your way through that, you could have the entire industry. And there are a number of industries where that's the case. In that case, we think you could have a private blockchain. You could simply sign everybody up. You could lock yourself down from that point of view. But from our perspective, back up in that International Space Station, we realized that that is millions of entities in global commerce, all the way to a bicycle delivery company. I mean, literally globally. At that level, it's not a New York City thing. It's not a US thing. At that level, go up there with me for a second, and all those views that we see from the International Space Station and from the SpaceX launches and all that stuff, think of that for a second. There's no borders, there's no anything. It's going to have to scale at that level. And so we realized early on that that was a fork in the road, and there weren't a lot of people at that point going down the side of the fork that we really saw, which was, no, I can't scale millions and millions of people to all agree to the same thing to get onto a blockchain. However, if you could hang an open source license, an Apache license, an MIT license, essentially on the threshold of this big global conference room and say, look, read through that, and if you're okay with that, come on in, it could scale globally. So in early 2019, we really started talking about co-opetition. That's the word you're going to hear again from that point of view. It's going to take a big global village. In this case, the bottom quote refers to that, which is we really came to the conclusion that for blockchain to be transformative, it had to be much bigger than us. And that's the real point. So I'm really glad that she started off by saying, look to your left and look to your right and ask questions and discuss blockchain this morning and Web3 this morning, because I would tell you the same thing. Look to your left and look to your right. This is the team that you're going to work on. These are the people that you're going to work on. And the co-opetition piece is not taught in most business schools. It's certainly not taught on your first day of work. And yet, we sit down, we're part of a trade association called the Global Express Association that only has 3 members, FedEx, DHL, and UPS. What? You guys are sitting down and having these conversations? Yes, we are. Because it's not about where we compete. That's the antitrust side of things. We certainly are a very hard line in the sand there from that point of view. It's not about where we compete, it's about where we can agree. So where would FedEx and DHL and UPS agree? We could agree that in the example that was my big aha moment a few minutes ago, where we can reduce friction across borders, that's delays, that's resources, that's people, that's dollars, that's everything. That's all the friction that we continue to see coming out of the pandemic in the global supply chain. Lots of things just sitting, waiting to clear, waiting to be processed. If we can reduce that friction, then we win, our customers win, and global trade also wins. So that led us to our greatest realization, and this was early 2019, is it's going to have to be bigger than us. For this thing to truly be transformative, it has to be bigger than us. And so here are some of the mistakes I think that we've made, collective we. I'll add myself, we'll add everybody in the room and everybody out here from that point of view. I think one of the things that has slowed this down tremendously, first of all, is its complexity. It is not intuitive. It is not intuitive. If we put a camera and a mic in front of all of you and say, tell me what blockchain is, tell me what Web3 is, we would have not quite as many people as we have in the room, but it would be a really high number. And by the way, early on I realized that I was not on the technical side, I was on the business and strategy side. And if I was going to have to speak to this, I needed to find some really basic, overly simplified definition. And so back to 2017, my definition was blockchain is a digital ledger that is permanent, transparent, and shared. So it is a ledger. Think of a double entry accounting. It is a ledger, but it's digital. It's permanent, which means it uses cryptography. Once something is in there, it is immutable. John and I can't change it. We can't do that, right? It's transparent, so if we are part of that transaction, we can see it, and it is shared, which is to say it exists on the cloud. So you're going to hear more about that as he follows me in just a little bit. It exists on the cloud. So, but we get all twisted around a lot of cases on this technical discussion of this whole thing, and I don't think we should. So the focus today is not on what's on the left side of this slide, which is who, what, and when. Who, FedEx, what, blockchain, when, we're all trying to figure that out, right? That's the guy on the 3rd floor that's pestering you. We've got to keep it on the right-hand side of this slide, which is the C-suite discussion, the business school discussion, the fiduciary responsibility, the risk and opportunity, and that gets us to the word why. Why blockchain? Under what set of circumstances would this be helpful? Why is that important? Why is FedEx standing here having this conversation with you? Because we believe that peer-to-peer technology, we believe smart contracts, we believe the other attributes from a blockchain or Web3 scenario are going to be transformative from that point of view. And the sooner we can, and if we are correct, then the sooner we can go from the side of the fork in the road where everybody's trying to get rich quick to the, wait a second, we actually think it's going to take a big global village, and if we do that, we can build out this big, broad thing that all of us can take advantage of. The sooner we can get to that side of the fork, the sooner we can scale this thing. We can get to scalability and adoption. So here's the quote from 1978 from Fred Smith. Now think about that. Today, we're all looking at that saying, well, yeah. I mean, it's, yeah, okay, I get it from that point. This is 1978. I'm not going to ask anybody what they were doing in 1978. 1978, he comes along and says, you know, the information about the package is as important as the package itself. This is long before Google. This is long before, I mean, all the examples that we can all think of from this point of view. He had already seen that importance from that point of view. So if I ask you, what do you think of FedEx? What does FedEx do? Most of you would give some example on the left-hand side of this slide. Oh, they pick up packages and move them from point A to point B. I would tell you that maybe the first 50 years, that might be fairly accurate from that point of view, although we think of ourselves as a technology company. On the right-hand side of the slide is actually the and. So the next 50 years is actually going to be both of these. So when we think of ourselves at this unique intersection of the physical and digital world, what I've got represented in the upper right-hand side of this slide is this blockchain tokenized digital twin. And you're hearing more and more about a digital twin. What does it look like? What does it mean? Where's that data? How do we do that? But now that we have data, now that we have the access to data, we can do all kinds of things with that data. You can do analytics on it. You can do optimization on it. You can get to predictive models. What will happen? You can get to prescriptive models. How can we make it happen? And now, that's your next 50 years. Your next 50 years is, yes, you're still going to pick, you're going to buy something, somebody's going to move it to you from wherever it is, across the street or down the street or around the world from that point of view. But the data about that is increasingly important because not only can we now model that logistics process and that distribution system and work with you on that, you can as well. You'll have much greater insights into what your own product is. And so again, I'm trying to loop this back to the C-suite from that point of view. Whatever you do, this data is going to be incredibly powerful to do it differently. And in many cases, in most cases, it's going to be a different model than you currently have today. That's why I'm enthusiastic and I'm challenging you to jump into this space. Put your toe in this water if you're not already there and have somebody learn it. Read a book. One of the first books that I read that really resonated with me was not the crypto book that's back here. It was Blockchain Revolution by Don Tapscott. Don and Alex Tapscott, and it came out in about 2016. They've updated it since that time, but it walks you through a number of business use cases. And so if you want to get into the lighter side of that and you're not a programmer, you're not on the technical side from that point of view, there are a number of great books out there, but that's one of those I would suggest. So when we talk about at this intersection of the physical and digital worlds, if that were a literal intersection, here's what we think that might look like. So if you literally are creating the physical and the digital world, we think there's several things that are right smack in the middle of that, and that's blockchain, sensor-based logistics. In our case, SenseAware is a proprietary product that we have. It's an IoT, Internet of Things device, and AI. So again, we've had the exhaust. If you think of the exhaust of a vehicle or something like that, we've had the exhaust of all those shipments for years, since the early 80s. Millions and millions and hundreds of millions of shipments by now from that point of view. That's exhaust. When you now start adding Internet of Things, IoT devices, sensors, which are increasingly going to be on almost everything, the amount of data that adds is a tremendous amount of exhaust. And we're going to go deeper into that in the next slide. And then AI gets you to all those analytics and optimization and predictive and prescriptive and other kinds of models from that point of view. So when we talk about physical versus digital, the physical world, we're all consumers, right? I ordered something, it hasn't been shipped yet, it's at origin, it's at hub, it's at destination, it's out for delivery, whatever the case may be. That's the top line of this thing. The digital world is not quite as simple as that. It actually looks much more like an MRI. There's multiple layers of this, and I've got another slide that's not in this material that really shows an MRI view. how deep this is going to get and how blockchain and Web3 are going to allow you to manage that at a very precise level. But provenance, authenticity, pedigree, is it a Megan original, and can she prove it? We don't really have that at this point. We're going to get it with blockchain. Traceability is essentially the same thing as the physical world, so it's an origin, it's a hub, it's a destination, it's something like that from that point of view. Chain of custody we've had for a really long time, but the history of it is it's kind of clunky, right? It was very manual for a long period of time. If you think of a police procedural movie or a TV show or something like that, where somebody goes to the room and signs it out and gives it to somebody else, it's essentially the same thing at this point. And there's a lot of that going on in cold chain, pharmaceuticals, high-value things, and from that point of view. We're better and better at that. It's much more automated from that point of view, but it's still a kind of a cumbersome process. And sensor-based logistics, I'm going to set this here for a second so I can use my hands here. Sensor-based logistics, so if you think of the origin, hub, destination, et cetera, of the physical world and that traceability piece, sensor-based logistics, so a device that is actually moving with the product gives you a ton more data. It is essentially a real-time, live, ping, 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 ping. It has a pulse going on throughout, and you can determine how fast those things pulse. But they are pulsing every number of seconds, or you can slow it down if you don't need that much. So it's going to give you, so again, origin, hub, destination, this is going to give you a ton more data, a lot more data for your analytics and optimization and all the rest of those kinds of things. But it's not till we get to the bottom line of this slide, blockchain, that it's going to glue that data together horizontally. And now you get to the true story of Megan. This is a Megan original, and I can prove it. I know where the coffee bean came from within the Starbucks ecosystem. I know that it is an original Rolex watch or a Gucci bag or a COVID vaccine made by Pfizer or Moderna or J&J or whatever the case may be. So where that applies, where that is important to have true authenticity of something, whether that is a product, whether that is a service, whatever the case may be, those are really your target-rich environments, we think, from a blockchain or a Web3 point of view. So in this case, now that we've glued this whole thing together, now I'm going to give you an example of that. So coming out of the pandemic, obviously we were all very concerned, very interested in vaccines as that happened. But I would also argue that the piece of paper that you're now given that says, has my name handwritten on it, and somebody wrote Pfizer or J&J, whatever the case may be on it, and a date, doesn't actually prove a lot. I mean, it's helpful. Certainly, we wanted to open society back up from that point of view, but not at a blockchain level, not at that point of view. Blockchain now, in a real-world example, could now get you to the point where we now know that one of those pharmaceutical companies, again, J&J, Moderna, Pfizer, whatever the case may be, actually created this. It's now in a vial. You've now got the ability to track a unique digital fingerprint of that vial, potentially all the way back up to the raw materials. That vial now goes into a box with 5 other vials, into a bigger box with a number of vials, under dry ice, whatever the case may be, moves across a border, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now when that vial comes back down, and now I'm at the pharmacy or wherever I get my vaccine shot, now you can actually prove that that vial that's going into my arm actually is a truly authentic Pfizer, pick your example, vaccine. And so, again, this isn't only about vaccines. I'm simply using that as an example. But where your product is important, where your brand is important, where that is of concern to you and you want to be able to prove that, there's an opportunity to step up into that level from that point of view. We actually did a use case earlier this year doing exactly that. So we actually moved a shipment of vaccine with a sensor-based logistic item on it. So that represents the physical world, that physical movement and all the data points and all that stuff, and we memorialized it onto an Ethereum blockchain, which is the digital world. Immutable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We think that's a foundational effort at this point because while it's a simple use case, it actually can scale really, really large from that point of view, where you can literally create and connect the physical and digital worlds. All kinds of things are possible. And again, back to the previous couple of slides, we think that's the next 50 years of not only FedEx, but a lot of entities. So this is Beth. Most of us, if you simply said, who is your customer? For most of us, we don't have to say, well, she's human, right? But in this case, she's human. And I make that distinction because smart contracts, or what I'm referring to here as a machine, is going to change that definition. So if my focus right now from a sales point of view is a sales territory and a sales lead and a physical address and all those kinds of things, as it is for many companies, most companies, we're going to have to rethink that at this point. Because Beth can say, this is a, let's see, it's a Q from DSAN.com. That's what this is. But it's a specific item. Beth can go out right now and say, let me create a smart contract. It's a series of if-then statements. So an example that I've shown here is if we deliver it on time, if we keep it within the right temperature, the right humidity, no shock, no light, whatever else we've agreed to with you, if, then you will pay me. It doesn't sound that transformative. But if you can automate that, if you can turn that into an automated process where you don't have to have a whole department full of auditors checking this and verifying this and all that, it's literally just built in. It's like a big fancy Excel macro from that point of view. So if I can do this, and it's paid, now we just got the CFO's attention. Now it's no longer a technology discussion because if I'm sitting with the C-suite and I say, by the way, CFO, Mr. or Ms., your average days outstanding right now are 40. If you could get it to 39 or 38, would that be of interest to you? Whoa, yeah, whoa, slow down. How do we do that? Well, we think smart contracts can help us get to that point. Because in that case, once that's the case and once it's automated, it could be a net zero. It could be a micropayment, an instant payment. Boom, 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 there it is. You have your money 39 or 40 or whatever your number is within your industry days earlier. And it wouldn't take long to ask the CFO, if you had your money 40 days earlier, would that be a good thing? Could you do something with that money? The answer, of course, is yes. It is a resounding yes from that point of view. CFO calmly looks at the CIO and says, how do we do this? Do you have anybody who can code those smart contracts? And looks at the chief legal officer and says, do you have attorneys who are bilingual in smart contracts and paper contracts? And now we're halfway around the C-suite on an actual business use case from that point of view. So we think smart contracts are really critical from that point of view, and they're still early on. It's still early on from that point of view. However, this is Beth. When we think of Beth as a customer, today if you ask me about a customer, I don't say human, but it's essentially, is that a shipper or a receiver? That's really kind of the only distinction we get to from that point of view. In this case, that binary distinction from a customer point of view is going to have to become a quadrant. So yes, shipper and receiver, but is it a human shipper or a machine shipper? The smart contract, in other words. And in this case, the reason why I'm going on about this is that they will all have wallets. Wallet's very important. When a smart contract has a wallet, and Beth now sets it up and says, I want you to go online, here's the price range of this unit, this specific, whatever unit you're hunting for. If you can find them below this, and it's an authentic, buy it, buy this many of them, and add a margin and stick them out on the website and turn that around. And from my point of view, I may never know about Beth, and I certainly don't know about her 8 or 12 smart contracts that are doing all this stuff. She doesn't have that. She's not storing that material. It's not in a storage unit. It's not in her garage. It's not in an industrial park. It won't hit her location. So in terms of thinking, how do we identify our customers, it's going to change a lot of this as well from that point of view. Again, I'm referring to smart contracts in that case as a machine. So Beth is a human. Beth is also a machine. Almost literally nothing in our world exists without some kind of standardization. We don't think about it. We don't, it just is part of what we do, right? Back in the mid-1800s, we had to get to the point where railroad tracks were some common width, right? They weren't prior to that. At some point, and we laugh about this one, but at some point, somebody came up with the concept of a four-way stop. Now, that doesn't exist that much in New York City, but it does where I live, right? And it does in most of the country. And why? Because at some point, there weren't enough vehicles on the road, and then, of course, there were a lot of people banging into each other, and somebody said, wait, we can improve this process, right? And somebody said, well, if we put one of these here, and then we create one definition of whoever got there first, if they're on the right go, there we go. That's standardization. A slight aside here, I was on a call a few weeks ago with a gentleman I know of in London, and I was walking through that, and I said, are you familiar with the concept of a four-way stop? And he said, is that like a roundabout? And I said, yeah, but we can't figure those out. You guys keep those in Europe, because I've never seen, once in a while you run into a town that has a lot of those. But standardization is critical. Telegraphs, or the alphabet, right? Or electricity. We don't have 6 different plugs in the US of, okay, well, here's one of the 6 that you can choose to plug into a wall. We're running through that, by the way, right now. I drive an electric vehicle, and I've followed that very closely. We're running into that exact same thing right now in terms of the charging infrastructure. The big 3 CEOs from Germany, Daimler, Mercedes, and Audi, Volkswagen, Porsche, calmly came out in 2019 and said, we believe the future of German vehicles is electric. And that sounds like, well, okay, well, what are you even talking about, Dale? Because they didn't say anything about the infrastructure. Yes, they did. They simply said, we're not going to fight over that layer of that. That's a necessary layer. However you plug it in, you can plug it in, but we're going to continue to fight at the model level. We aren't yet at that point in the US, but we're going to get to that point. And standardization is absolutely critical in this space. We have to get to a point where we agree on what blockchain and Web3 is. We have to agree on a number of other things from that point of view. We're seeing that play itself out right now through the SEC. The SEC chairman is a former professor who focused on cryptocurrency and blockchain. And so certainly there's a lot of regulatory discussions around that and all those things from that point of view. But the important part of that is that once we get to standardization, as I show on the slide, it increases the enhanced network effects and it increases adoption. Once I know what the rules are, as an entrepreneur, I can jump into that space. I know how to do that. It's not the wild, wild west anymore from that point of view. So certainly we want to see that happen. We want to see everybody work their way through that. And I mentioned previously here about co-opetition. We didn't get to that point from an altruistic point of view. Oh, let's just all sit down and work with each other from that point of view. We worked our way through the use cases early on, 2017, and we simply hit a fork in the road. We didn't realize it was a fork until we realized it simply wouldn't scale, right? We can't get everybody to do that if they're all making their own definitions and all the rest of that stuff. I'm not going to build a blockchain that my competitor is I'm going to charge my competitor for, or vice versa. I'm just not going to do it. It just won't work, right, from that point of view. And so, so here's the example of that, and here's why we get to that point. So if you think of what's on the right here, think of it as some futuristic city called blockchain, right? It's the future. Whatever you think of blockchain or Web3 at this point, it's represented on the right-hand side of the slide. Think of Dubai, a very futuristic-looking city, or a lot of cities in China that are very futuristic from that point of view. And here we are. We're sitting at a conference in New York City, and we're like, there it is. What are we waiting for? Let's just go do it. Well, come on, let's go. The problem is, from my point of view, we're separated by a canyon. If you think of early on in the Web 2 days, the Web 1 and Web 2 days, where browsers were still new, if you recall, there was a big attempt to monetize those browsers, right? At that point in time, the journey, the bridge across this canyon was actually oh, wow, I can make some money on that. Some of those same bright, capable people that moved on to do that. Well, now you don't care how I get to your website. You don't care. You just want my clicks and my shopping cart activity and my views and all those kinds of things. But you're agnostic as to how I got there, right? We think the same thing is going to happen to a great extent within blockchain. And we think it's going to take co-opetition. We think it's going to take a big global village, the person to your left, the person to your right, me, all the other people from that point of view. We think it's going to take all of us working together to build this foundational layer. As I said, in a lot of cases, there are small industries where if you got 20 or 30 people to sign up to a private blockchain, you'd have the entire industry. And I'm aware of a couple of those examples from that point of view. But at global commerce levels, at that back up to the International Space Station from that point of view, we don't think that will work. We think that what we need to work on is to create this bridge that gets us all to the other side. And once we're to the other side, again, think of an interstate highway system. If that didn't exist, we don't think any one company could build it. However, if we could split this room in two and say, okay, one group, you work on how to build the interstate highway system, and figure that out. And the other group, you realize that it doesn't exist yet, but I want you to focus on could you monetize it? And how could you monetize it? You'd come up with truck stops every 10 exits. You'd come up with fast food. You'd come up with outlet malls. You'd come up with all kinds of things from that point of view. And we think, unfortunately, a lot of people wanted to simply jump to this side. We've spent a lot of years on the who, what, when. And the why gets us to, once it's built, all kinds of things can happen. But it's going to take a number of us to actually do that. And so with that, I will wrap up and leave ourselves a few minutes for questions.
Well, we did have one question come in.
Okay.
Are smart contracts generally intended to be visible in the blockchain, similar to other content, or are they intended to be private to contract participants? Or more generally, how do you visualize and manage the visibility in a co-opetition environment like the DHL, UPS, FedEx relationship?
Like 9 questions in there. Smart contracts would be between 2 people. If you wanted to expose those, you could expose those. But again, a smart contract, you and I would have some agreement, something that we would work our way through and say, I'll do this. Again, the if-then scenario that I pointed out. If we move it on time, if we keep it at the right temperature, humidity, et cetera, then you will pay me. You would not expose that for everybody to see from that point of view. And at a broader level, there are a lot of things that are still being worked out in terms of that, which is one of the reasons it hasn't scaled so far. This data, like I said, I've got an MRI level view of this that goes really, really deep into that. But from a carrier point of view, the FedExes of the world, et cetera, I'm only really going to have the logistics portion of that. I don't need your intellectual property. I don't need your margins. I don't want that. I don't need that. You don't want me to have it, right? Let alone the unique digital fingerprint from that point of view. So there's this whole series of data points that are ultimately going to kind of come together. You're going to be able to isolate that and say, look, I am the owner of that. I'm only going to share a certain amount of information with my customer and vice versa. And so if we think of customs and clearance and things like that, you may get one step upstream, one step downstream, but you certainly wouldn't have the full view. If you were the owner, you could have whatever you need, but as a carrier, I don't need that. I just need a little sliver of that. The authenticity is yours. I'm not going to make money off of your authenticity. There's ways to do that from that point of view, but we've got to get this structure out there first for anybody to take advantage of that.
Great. And it was interesting, on the Slido questions, we asked what percentage of the audience, if you're using blockchain or not, and the room was split 50-50. Are you surprised by that? Or?
No, I'm happy that there's 50% of the people that are using blockchain. And so is my new friend from Amazon and others. They're all very happy with that, right? So,
awesome.
No, that's fantastic.
Good. Well, we're going to learn more. Give Dale a round of applause. Thank you, Dale, for being here.